Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be getting started in just a moment. We'll give a minute or two for folks to join. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining. This is the webinar, Manufacturing and the Economic Lives of Black, Brown, and Other People of Color. We'll be getting started in just a moment. Again, give it another minute or two for people to join. All right, I think we're going to get started. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. This is the webinar, Manufacturing and the Economic Lives of Black, Brown, and Other People of Color. And we're thrilled to have you here today, and we're thrilled to have with us Dr. Valerie Wilson from the Economic Policy Institute to give this webinar. My name is Ben Beachy. I'm at Blue Green Alliance, which is hosting this webinar. I'm our Vice President for Manufacturing and Industrial Policy. For those of you who are not familiar with the Blue Green Alliance, we are a coalition of 13 national unions and environmental groups. And Blue Green Alliance's mission is to unite labor and environmental organizations to take on many of the most pressing issues that we face today: climate change, toxic pollution, economic insecurity, and structural inequity, with policy solutions that offer a win-win-win for climate, jobs, and justice. Solutions that simultaneously support quality jobs, a livable climate, clean air and water, and greater economic and racial justice. And part of that work is to ramp up clean manufacturing while cutting industrial pollution. And manufacturing is indeed what we are here to talk about today. I'll speak briefly to that work in just a second. Another part of this mission is Blue Green Alliance's Building Clean project. And to describe that work, I'll hand it over to Dana Saylor, who is leading the charge on our Building Clean project.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. Again, my name is Dana Saylor. I'm the National Program Manager for the Blue Green Alliance Foundation. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today and want to welcome you on behalf of our Building Clean project, which is dedicated to helping grow manufacturing through the purchase of building materials that are made in the US and free from harmful chemicals that can impact the health of residents and workers. We promote buy local, buy healthy as a concept and approach to building and retrofitting energy efficient, affordable housing, and do this primarily through our buildingclean.org website, which allows users to search for over 4,600 manufacturing facilities in the US, making building products to help them identify US and union-made products being made as close to their project sites as possible. The site also helps educate people about hazardous chemicals in building products, their health impacts, and helps them identify and search for products carrying third-party certifications and transparency information so they can select building products free from the most harmful content. We are thrilled to have Dr. Valerie Wilson joining us today to help us build a better understanding of how important manufacturing jobs are to creating thriving communities and build a better case for the buy local aspects of Building Clean's work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dana. So again, we are here today to talk about manufacturing and racial equity, namely how unfair trade deals and other botched policies have contributed to the decline in US manufacturing, and how that decline and the resulting loss of good paying jobs has disproportionately impacted workers of color, namely Black workers. And we're lucky to have with us today Dr. Valerie Wilson from the Economic Policy Institute as a leading expert on this very topic. And before I hand it over to Valerie, I just want to say a few words about how the Blue Green Alliance comes to this topic. For years, the Blue Green Alliance has pushed for policies to reverse the decline in manufacturing and help spur manufacturing renewal. In particular, we push to expand quality manufacturing jobs to produce the electric vehicles, the wind turbines, the batteries, clean steel and clean aluminum, and other clean energy goods that we need for a fairer economy, healthier workers and communities, and a livable climate. Now, to get there, we are working to turn unfair trade policy on its head. We're proposing new pro-worker, pro-climate, pro-equity trade policies that would reverse decades of outsourcing of both jobs and pollution. And at the same time, we're pushing for the government to use its vast purchasing power to spur demand for union-made electric vehicles, clean steel, and other clean manufacturing goods. And we're also working across movements to push for bold investments in clean manufacturing. Namely, we're pushing to get the reconciliation bill that is right now before the Senate across the finish line. There's over $30 billion in that bill to cut industrial pollution and ramp up clean energy manufacturing. So with this interlocking mix of new trade, procurement, and investment policies, we have the opportunity to foster the manufacturing renewal that workers and communities deserve. Now, there's a long list of reasons that we should be pushing for growth in clean manufacturing, so that we have a dependable supply chain for critical clean energy sectors, so that we do not rely on worker exploitation overseas to produce our clean energy goods, so that workers and communities can capture more of the economic gains of the clean energy transition, and so that those economic gains are more equitably shared. It has been well documented how the decline in manufacturing in the United States under unfair trade policies has contributed to income inequality, as laid off manufacturing workers have faced lower paying service sector jobs as the only real options they face, which has put downward pressure on middle class wages. But less reported is how that manufacturing decline and the resulting pay cuts have disproportionately impacted Black workers and other workers of color, exacerbating racial inequity. So we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Valerie Wilson from the Economic Policy Institute, who is a leading expert on this issue and an author of a new report on this very topic. The report just came out in January. It's called Botched Policy Responses to Globalization Have Decimated Manufacturing Employment, with Often Overlooked Costs for Black, Brown, and Other Workers of Color. Now, the report not only provides data and analysis to clearly lay out the problem, it also presents a path forward to reverse the trend of declining manufacturing and its magnification of racial inequity. And with that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Valerie Wilson. She is director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. And that is a nationally recognized source for expert reports, for policy analyses on the economic condition of America's people of color. Prior to joining EPI, Dr. Wilson was an economist and vice president of research at the National Urban League in the Washington Bureau. And there she was responsible for planning and directing the Bureau's research agenda. She has written and spoken extensively on a wide array of issues impacting economic inequality in the United States. That includes employment and training, income and wealth disparities, access to higher education, and social insurance. So I'm gonna hand it now to Dr. Wilson for her presentation. She will be presenting some slides. Those slides we can make available afterwards. And then after the presentation, we will move to questions and answers and further discussion. So thank you again, Dr. Wilson, so much for taking your time to be with you today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Blue Green Alliance for inviting me to participate in this webinar today and for hosting it, and thanks to all who have joined. The work I'm going to be presenting today is a report I co-wrote with several of my colleagues, Rob Scott, who is our trade economist, along with two of our research assistants, Jory Kandra and Daniel Perez, who helped us tremendously in pulling together all of this data and presenting it in what we call our chart book form. And so the starting point for all of this has to do with, here we go. here we go, getting my slides to advance, has to do with 7 major data points that we wanted to present. And today I'm going to be focusing really on 4 of those that I think are most relevant as I talk specifically about the impact of jobs in manufacturing and construction and why they are so critical to greater economic security for workers of color, and in general for all workers who would be considered working class by virtue of the fact that that is loosely referred to for those workers who have less than a college degree. So the 4 major points that I want to make today are: first, there were nearly 7 million jobs that would be supported by a 4-year, $2 trillion infrastructure and climate change investment program, combined with trade and industrial policies that dramatically boost US exports and eliminate the US trade deficit. The result of rebalancing trade, investing in infrastructure, and addressing climate change would help to rebalance the economy back from lower paying service sector jobs to higher paying jobs in manufacturing and construction. And I will go through all of this in more detail and show what those differences and comparisons are there. The third point is that supporting new manufacturing jobs is important, specifically for Black workers who have been particularly hard hit by globalization and the decline of manufacturing employment. And then finally, these jobs are not only beneficial to Black workers. In fact, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and white workers without a college degree all earn substantially more in manufacturing than in non-manufacturing industries. So the starting point here is really looking at what has happened with the trade deficit and manufacturing employment over the same period of time. So this first chart shows that between 1998 and 2021, at the same time that we saw the trade deficit taking off, going past about $1 trillion, the US also lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs. Now, it's important to understand the full context there, because at the same time that those jobs were lost in manufacturing, those jobs were gained in other sectors of the economy. In fact, nearly all of the employment growth between 1998 and 2019, again, this is the net job growth, can be accounted for by the tremendous growth in service sector employment. Prior EPI research also finds that between 2001 and 2011 alone, the growth of the trade deficit with China displaced nearly 1 million jobs held by workers of color. That represents a total of 35% of the jobs that were displaced. As a result, in 2011 alone, those 958,800 workers, that's the exact number, workers of color displaced from higher earning jobs in manufacturing and other traded industries into lower earning jobs in non-traded industries such as the service industry. They earned about $10,500 less in annual wages as a result of that shift out of manufacturing into these lower earning jobs. That translates to a total loss of about $10.1 billion a year. So again, it wasn't just a matter of changing the composition of jobs in the economy. There were economic consequences that went along. In fact, a significant loss in earnings that accompanied that shift out of manufacturing into more service sector employment. Again, why that is important. This just gives you a very quick look at the comparison of wages and benefits paid in 3 industries that are key to this transition. One, the obvious thing I hope you take away from this is that the industry where a lot of jobs were growing in that period of time, the service industry, pay much lower wages and lower benefits than both the manufacturing and construction industry. Manufacturing lost jobs, I mentioned nearly 5 million jobs, and growth in construction was very low in that time as well. Now, again, another reason why that is important in thinking about not only the change in the numbers of jobs and the composition across industries, the differences in wages that are offered across those different industries. The other point to take away from that, and is very important to thinking about why this has implications for workers of color in particular, is that the shift away from manufacturing and construction employment to more service industry employment meant lost opportunities for non-college educated workers in particular. And I mentioned at the beginning, we often will shorthand non-college educated workers as working class. And that's because manufacturing and construction industries, as you will see in this graph, employ a significantly larger share of workers with less than a 4-year college degree. About 85% of construction workers and almost 70% of manufacturing workers do not have a 4-year college degree, while about 63% of service sector workers are non-college educated workers. So again, these jobs are available, quite frankly, to a wider share of the labor force. There's also a bar here showing educational attainment for the entire workforce. And as you will see there, in fact, most workers in our economy do not have 4-year college degrees or higher. So these are jobs that are widely accessible to a large percentage of the working age population. Now, this next graph just contrasts that and looks at educational attainment by race and ethnicity. And again, this drives home the point of why the implications of those job losses, the fact that the shift in jobs went to lower paying sectors, has such an impact on Black workers as well as Hispanic and other workers of color. And this shows quite simply Black and Hispanic, as well as American Indian and Alaska Native workers are much less likely to have a 4-year college degree, or more likely to be in that working class category. Now, this graph is probably what I consider the main point, or the biggest aha moment, or maybe the biggest question mark in the entire report, because it shows the change in Black workers' share of the entire workforce, along with the change in Black workers' share of manufacturing employment. The thing that should quickly jump out and become obvious here is that a huge wedge, we start to see a huge wedge between Black workers' share of the overall workforce and their share of manufacturing employment beginning around the 1990s. Prior to that, the share of manufacturing employment of Black workers increased and was pretty consistent with their share of their representation in the overall workforce. Again, beginning around the 1990s, although we continued to see Black workers increase as a share of the total workforce, they declined significantly in terms of their share of manufacturing employment. And while the loss of more than 5 million manufacturing jobs definitely hurt all workers who depended on those jobs to support themselves and their families, the losses among Black workers were uniquely troubling for a number of reasons. One, related to the history of why there was such significant representation of Black workers in manufacturing. During the Great Migration, millions of Black Americans who left the rural South were searching for better job opportunities and often went to northern industrial cities in search of those opportunities. Now, while Black workers were initially limited to some of the lowest wage and often most dangerous factory jobs, after decades of protest and fighting for access to more desirable positions in manufacturing, that industry eventually became one where manufacturing employment became a vehicle for the economic mobility of a number of Black workers, providing an opportunity for people to have access to um, family sustaining jobs with good benefits, often including pensions and retirement benefits, as well as higher wages. The other thing that's important to understand about why this trend is uniquely troubling, and what's not shown in this graph, is that this shift occurred alongside the shift of a substantial share of US manufacturing employment to Southern states. Now, why is that significant? Southern states are where Black workers account for a much larger share of the population relative to other regions of the country. So we see a decline in employment of Black workers in manufacturing at the same time that more of those jobs or more of those manufacturing employers are in fact moving to a region of the country where there is a larger share of the Black population. So that is something that isn't quite consistent with what we may expect. Another point that's important to make about this being a unique trend or unique feature here is that over the same period of time, the number and share of Hispanic and Asian American Pacific Islander workers in manufacturing rose rapidly over the past 20 years in particular. And this was in line with their dramatic rise in the overall shares of the workforce. So again, this is a unique feature. Other groups who saw their share of the workforce rising also saw that there was an increase in their representation in manufacturing. White workers actually saw a decline in their share of the workforce, and in line with that, a decline in their share of manufacturing employment. So it's only Black workers where we see this divergent trend between their share of the overall workforce and their share in employment share in the manufacturing industry. Now, the other point that is important to make about there being relatively higher paying jobs in the manufacturing industry and why that would matter is that even when we look at the lowest earning workers, non-college educated workers in manufacturing compared to other industries, there is a significant difference in their earnings. Manufacturing provides good, steady employment, even for those who are in the 10th percentile of earners. So these are some of the lowest earners in the economy. They are making at least twice as much as their peers outside of manufacturing. And that is due in part to the fact that average weekly hours in manufacturing tend to be higher than in other industries. But it's also the case that unionization rates are much higher in manufacturing. And I'll say more about the impact of unionization briefly in a few more slides. So the previous chart showed differences in earnings for the 10th percentile workers. This shows differences at the median. So again, the pay differential is much larger for those who are the lowest earners, but there's also a significant pay differential between manufacturing and non-manufacturing employment, even for median workers. Now, on to the point I wanted to make about unionization. This chart shows that workers in construction and manufacturing are much more likely to be unionized than those in the services industry. This is important, this is significant because research shows that unions also help reduce racial and gender-based economic disparities and support families with better benefits and job protections, as well as better retirement security. Historically, unions have disproportionately benefited low and moderate income workers, as indicated by the couple of charts back where I was showing the 10th percentile earnings comparison between manufacturing and non-manufacturing. They disproportionately benefit the lowest income workers, as well as those with lower levels of education, and workers of color. So unionization becomes a major factor in why these jobs tend to be better paying jobs and more widely accessible. So this just shows the union premium, wage premium that is available across these different industries. And so this shows that unionized workers in construction and manufacturing each earn much higher hourly wages than non-unionized workers with similar characteristics in these industries. These union wage premium estimates control for the effects of education, occupation, experience, race, ethnicity, and other factors that can help explain wage differences. And so we see that the union wage premium in construction is more than 4 times as large as in the services industry, and the union wage premium in manufacturing is more than twice as large. Now, the question that may come out of this is, why is there such a big difference between the union wage premium in construction compared to manufacturing? Well, first, manufacturing workers must compete with low wage workers in countries such as China, Mexico, South Korea, and Vietnam, due to the fact that these are jobs that can be outsourced, can be sent abroad. So they have to compete with those workers in a way that those in construction don't have to. And so even if they're in unions, they still have much less bargaining power than construction workers in unions would have, because they don't face those same competitive pressures. It's also true that manufacturing work has been increasingly outsourced to less unionized staffing and temporary help services, which also puts substantial downward pressure on wages of US manufacturing workers. So what you don't see in this chart is, this is exclusively wages. But if we were to show overall union pay premium, including benefits, the manufacturing and construction premiums would be a little closer, but there would still be a significant difference here for many of the reasons that I just explained. Now, nearly half of the jobs that would be supported by climate and infrastructure investment and rebalancing trade would be good middle-class jobs in manufacturing and employment. These estimates are based on a 2020 EPI analysis by Scott, Mokhiber, and Perez of the job creation potential of a two-pronged strategy for rebuilding the economy that includes $2 trillion of investments in infrastructure, clean energy, and energy efficiency improvements over 4 years, combined with trade and industrial policies that eliminate the US trade deficit. So again, by making many of those investments to improve our climate, to restructure and rebuild our economy, to address the trade deficit, nearly half of those jobs would go to the industries that, as I've just shown over previous slides, would be creating good jobs that would be more widely accessible to a larger share of the population and would have disproportionate benefits for workers of color in particular. Now, the final slide here just sort of brings it all together and puts a fine point on all of this. Jobs created by rebuilding the US economy around high wage jobs and manufacturing support much higher pay than service sector work. That really is the bottom line and the main point here, and should be a motivating factor to make these kinds of investments. There are 3 bars that we're comparing across different racial and ethnic groups in this chart. The blue is showing the average earnings of jobs created by trade rebalancing. Green is infrastructure and climate investments, and the red represents the services industry. So again, average weekly earnings, both in terms of jobs created by trade rebalancing and infrastructure and climate investments, are much higher for all racial and ethnic groups than we would get for jobs created in the services industry. The other thing that's not shown in this chart that's important to note here is that these job gains could push wages up for workers throughout the economy, because the types of jobs created in infrastructure and created by infrastructure and clean energy investments and boosting U.S. exports would be these higher paying manufacturing and construction jobs that are historically have been open to non-college educated workers. Now, raising demand for these workers by virtue of the fact that these new jobs, would be jobs that would demand workers at that level of skill, would raise their pay, not just in those jobs, but in other jobs in the economy, because there is increased demand for those kinds of workers. And when combined with strong emphasis and policies and practices that ensure that Black, Hispanic, and other workers of color can access these jobs, the rebuilding plan would contribute to greater racial equity in the economy overall. That is the end of my presentation. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions or any points of discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Chock full of information. And as I anticipate some people will have the question, we will be sharing these slides afterwards. And thank you for making them available in very clear form, Dr. Wilson. We also are recording this webinar, so we're happy to share the recording afterwards. So we're now going to turn to question and answer. So I put out there in the chat, but feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to pose a question to Dr. Wilson, just type it in and submit it, and we'll be calling out some of those questions. I'm going to kick off a question that came in about specifically whether we know the kinds of jobs that Black workers displaced from manufacturing have taken on. You mentioned service sector jobs in general. I'm wondering if you have any particular information on the kinds of jobs that Black workers displaced have taken on, and how the wages, benefits, and union representation of those new jobs compared to the manufacturing jobs that left.
Yeah. So the main point, probably easy answer there, is that there's really no comparison between the jobs in the service sector that became available and the jobs that were lost. Because of that difference in unionization between manufacturing and the services sector, as well as the significant difference in the union wage premium that's available in manufacturing compared to services. So even if you went to a service industry that was unionized, the premium of being represented or covered by a contract in the services industry is lower than it would have been in manufacturing. In terms of what kinds of jobs people went into, generally speaking, the reason for the lower earnings in the service sector is because people went into jobs that were lower paying. So it may be service sector jobs in food services and hospitality. Some of the health aid positions also are relatively lower paying than those that would have been available in manufacturing.
Thank you. A couple of questions coming in on policy. You mentioned, that industrial policy. There's clearly a package of investments before Congress in the reconciliation bill. Curious if there's investments in that bill that would help not only to reverse the decline in manufacturing, but particularly reverse the disproportionate impact on Black workers by creating manufacturing jobs in Black communities and other communities of color.
So one of the things that we looked at in the report, and probably in the appendix section, we looked specifically, we did a deeper dive in looking even within manufacturing, what subsectors of manufacturing did we see there was a concentration of different workers. And for Black workers, overwhelmingly, the greater representation was in auto manufacturing. Again, given the history that I talked about when people were moving to more industrial cities, And in particular, a lot of the auto manufacturers in the Rust Belt in Michigan and in Detroit and Flint. We can all look at those cities now and see what happened to those places in terms of not just the jobs, but the overall economic stability in those kinds of places. And so one of the points that we make is that should be something that we can look to see where people were concentrated before in jobs that were well paying. And that can help provide some indication or guidance for the kinds of investments that would then have a disproportionate benefit. With autos being a major sector that employed African Americans, investments that would boost production of clean energy, electric vehicles is one that would definitely be important for consideration.
Thank you. Related question was about job opportunities in clean energy. Similarly, whether you see potential for disproportionate benefits for Black workers and other communities of color that have been hard hit by the manufacturing decline in any clean energy sectors.
Definitely. I think, again, any jobs that we're able to create in these industries, manufacturing or construction related jobs, we've shown that there is a disproportionate benefit in terms of the wages and benefits that are available there, but also because those kinds of jobs tend to be more widely accessible. There are few restrictions and limitations to the qualifications that are typically posted around those jobs. And so, the benefit of clean energy investments is twofold. It has an economic benefit in terms of the industries where those jobs would be created being more likely to be industries that are more likely to be unionized, have higher wages and higher benefits, but also just the benefit to the climate and as a matter of environmental justice. Those are the kinds of investments that need to be made in all communities. So those are jobs potentially that should be available regardless of where you live or where you reside in the country or within a city itself.
Thank you. We have a question. Do the remaining manufacturing companies that are still here, do they consistently report difficulty hiring? And how does this intersect with the broader manufacturing trends? Are there differences like across industries such as auto?
I don't have an answer to that question. I have not done a deep enough dive to figure out if the current discussion in the economy about labor shortage is something that applies broadly to manufacturing. I do know that during the most recent downturn, the majority of jobs were lost in services. So in leisure and hospitality, so that would include restaurants, hotels. That's where a lot of the job loss occurred, and those are also the sectors where they're reporting more difficulty in finding workers. There was not nearly as much job loss in the manufacturing industry. And so, at this point, that wasn't an industry where they were needing to hire many more workers quickly because of the losses that occurred in the shutdown and then the quick reopening that happened thereafter. So manufacturing, at least in the current downturn, wasn't affected in the same way that some of the service industries were affected. And so that is not really an indication that they're reporting huge labor shortages in manufacturing now.
Got it. Thank you. Just a friendly reminder to everyone, if you'd like to submit questions, they're pouring in right now. Feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen and submit your question, and we'll be reading them out. Another question that has come in is, you spoke about the decline in manufacturing jobs affecting union representation, given the disparity between the manufacturing sector and service sector particularly. Curious about how the decline in manufacturing jobs has particularly affected the representation of Black workers in unions.
Yeah, so when we look at trends in union membership, union coverage, they have been declining over the last several decades. Along with that decline, we see that the rates of union membership across different demographic groups is also converging. So if we go back to the early mid 1970s, Black workers clearly were more likely to be in unions. There's a huge what am I trying to say? A much larger share of Black workers in unions relative to other racial and ethnic groups. Over time, as we've seen that decline in unionization, in part due to the loss of manufacturing jobs, we've seen those rates across groups get much, much closer now, so that they're all within about a percentage point of each other compared to when it was, a significant advantage for Black workers in earlier decades.
Thank you. You mentioned the unfair trade policies are partly to blame for the decline in manufacturing. It's disproportionately impacted Black workers and other workers of color. What new kinds of trade policies would help to reverse this trend? Supporting manufacturing in general and supporting Black manufacturing workers specifically.
So that is a question that probably would be better answered by my co-author on this piece, Rob Scott, who's our trade economist, who goes much deeper on these things than I do. But I know specifically, he talks a lot about the need to rebalance the trade deficit, and a lot of that being related to currency. And the issue of currency manipulation being one that has to be addressed in order to rebalance that deficit. But also, the investment in investments that will boost domestic manufacturing would also help contribute to narrowing that deficit.
Awesome. We have a question about training and education. I'm curious what you see as the role of schools, vocational schools, and targeted training programs in supporting renewal and manufacturing, and particularly in increased manufacturing for Black workers and others who've been disproportionately impacted by manufacturing's decline.
Yeah. I think those kinds of programs can play an important role in helping people gain access to those jobs, mainly because those programs often, a part of that is that they build relationships with employers, so that at the same time that people are getting the training and skill necessary to perform those jobs, there is at the end of that a closer link to an actual job. So it's not training just for the sake of training. That often a lot of those programs are sort of feeder programs to actual employers. So I think that they can play an important role, again, in helping people get in the pipeline and get access to those jobs in a way that would be more direct and more inside than someone maybe just sort of coming from the outside and just wanting to apply among an entire pool of other applicants. I think the relationships that are built there help to funnel and filter workers directly into those jobs.
Got it. One person submits this question. I spent 43 years in manufacturing and have seen so many plants close. I blame management wanting to outsource for cheap labor and avoid EPA regulations. What is your opinion on this as a matter?
Yeah. So the charts we have here focus on employment, so the number of jobs that were lost as a result of this. But the point about, these individual jobs translate to entire factories being shut down is another major point that we make in the report in writing, although we don't picture that or depict that in a graph. And I believe it was something like 70 manufacturing plants over that same period of time shut down, which has a ripple effect on the entire community, because in many places they are, a significant economic anchor in those places. And yes, any economic decision is almost always going to be driven on the part of those in control or in management for the sake of profit maximization. And so if it becomes cheaper to produce something somewhere else, because largely labor is cheaper, then that decision is one that often becomes attractive to those making those sorts of decisions. The other part of the question was about, was that the entire?
That was big, yeah. Why, whether you see management choosing to outsource to avoid to get cheaper labor and to avoid environmental regulations as a core cause.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, the environmental regulations, this is the other part I was thinking about. Again, that is related to the impact that has on profits. You can do things cheaper when there are less regulations that require you to take the steps to do things in a way that would be safer for the environment, but also safer for the people who you're employing. And so yes, decisions to outsource or offshore jobs are often done for the sake of avoiding those regulations that in the United States would be more costly because of our regulatory structure, but also again, because the cost of labor here is higher because people earn higher wages on average than they do in other countries, at least in the countries that these jobs go to.
Thank you. We've got like one or two more questions left in the stack. So last call, if anyone else would like to submit a question, please go ahead and do so now. So here's a question. You have named several policy and responses to the problem. Investments, direct investments in manufacturing, trade, policy changes. You talked about training. The question is, do we have a strategy to accomplish our goals that doesn't depend on a trifecta of democratic control, Senate, House, and White House at the federal level? That is there a strategy that can win some of the changes that we need, either with some Republican support or at the state level?
So, the investments in infrastructure generally tend to be things that are bipartisan. I think, most, that has tended to be one where there's less division. Everyone agrees that we need to invest in our infrastructure. I think politics always complicates good policy. And so, it can become sort of a bargaining chip for other things that people want to throw into bills. So I think the complication will come in other things that get attached to bills that do have broader support that eventually results in some of the division and the failure to get things passed. I wish it were easier to do things that are just good economic policy, but I think we're at a point now in American politics where that is increasingly difficult. So unfortunately, I don't have an easy answer to that question.
I don't think you're unique in that. So we have a question about one of the graphs, one of the key points you made on slide that you mentioned that the difference between manufacturing jobs and service sector jobs was about $10,500 on average. And this person was surprised that it was not actually more than that. So I'm curious if you have any intuition about why the difference is not more. Sometimes we hear stories about greater differences than that.
So again, that number was based on an analysis that was looking specifically at the impact of, I believe it was trade with China. And so comparing the jobs that were lost in manufacturing as a result of China trade to service sector jobs, that's what that comparison was based on. And again, these are broad, large industries. So, and those are average numbers. And so, that can sort of skew the analysis in one direction or another. But on average, that difference per worker was in about that $10,000 range.
Yep, law of averages. So that's it for the questions that we have received so far. Unless anyone has a burning question, feel free to submit right now, but I don't see any other burning ones. Dr. Wilson, any final words that we should keep in mind as we go forth, thinking about how we can support renewal of manufacturing, and particularly renewal of manufacturing for Black workers and other workers of color that have been disproportionately impacted by manufacturing's decline?
I think it's important to remember that any policy is going to have implications for racial equity because of the history and structure of our society, our economy. And it just so happens that, there was a period in our history when there were hard-fought battles for people to gain access to the better paying jobs in manufacturing. And the loss of that has resulted in widening of pay gaps. In particular, we can see in the region of the country where a lot of those jobs were lost. I didn't, get to make that point in the presentation, but when we look at racial wage gaps, at one point they were the smallest in the Midwestern region of the United States, largely because of access to those higher paying unionized manufacturing jobs. And as those jobs lost, we saw those wage gaps widen in that area to the point where they look more along the magnitude of wage gaps that we see in the South, which has historically always had the largest disparities. So I think it's important to recognize how critical and how important those kinds of jobs have been historically, and to recognize the benefit, again, not just to individuals, but to entire communities. And that alone should be motivation for really rebuilding that sector of our economy to help rebuild communities and to strengthen the US economy more generally speaking, because again, they're disproportionate benefits for Black workers, but all workers in those communities have benefited and can benefit again from those kinds of jobs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for lending your time and your expertise. I think again, plenty of data, plenty of strong analysis to go on as we depart and think about the ways that we can work to push for policies that would support renewal manufacturing for the causes of greater racial equity, climate action, and greater economic justice at the same time. So really appreciate it. I'm sure this is not the final conversation we will have on this subject as we go forth and fight for the investments in the reconciliation bill, trade policy transformation, among other things. So thank you again for your time, and thank you to everyone for joining this webinar hosted by Blue Green Alliance. We will be sending out slides and recording for you to go back through all of the material that Dr. Wilson covered. And if you have further follow-up questions, feel free to send those our way as well. And we look forward to having more webinars like this to show a path forward for fighting for manufacturing renewal that supports our shared climate, jobs, and justice goals. Thank you all.
Thank you.